Hey everyone, Ethan here. For the first 10 years or so of my life, I had primarily Nintendo consoles, with the only exception being a PlayStation 2. So it's kinda crazy to me that I would go on to become primarily an Xbox player. But here we are in 2022. Halo is my favorite game series, with others not even coming close. I bonded with and even met some of my friends through Halo. I've attended conventions just to meet the voice actors. It definitely holds the title for the most amount of time and effort I've ever put into a series. I love these games, and I'm so glad that I discovered them. Halo Combat Evolved wasn't my first or even my second Halo game. It was my fourth. I discovered the series back in 2010 when my brother got Halo Reach for Christmas. My love for the series bloomed over the next several years. So you might be wondering, if this game is so amazing, what is it? Well, Halo CE is a sci-fi first-person shooter where you play as the Master Chief, a genetically augmented super soldier whose goal is to defend humanity from a genocidal group of aliens known as the Covenant. He also has a trustworthy, bubbly AI companion named Cortana by his side. The game features both a single-player campaign and a multiplayer mode which allows you to team up with and face off against other players. Before I start properly explaining why I love this game, I want to point out that Halo is one of those games where I know and plan to talk about much more of the game than I would any other game. I'm incredibly passionate about this series and want to do it justice. So get ready. Halo pioneered the FPS genre at the time by popularizing now staple features such as carrying two weapons at a time and having movement and aiming being tied to two different control sticks. In this game, you can shoot, reload, switch weapons, throw grenades, melee, crouch, jump, and even drive, ride, and pilot vehicles. You even get a flashlight! Since you play as a Spartan, which is essentially a super soldier, guns are incredibly accurate even when firing from the hip, although a select few have scopes that allow for more precise aiming. You will also notice that this game has two forms of health, which are just regular health and energy shields. Your shields are your first line of defense. Your shields will recharge themselves after not taking any damage for a few seconds. Your health, however, does not regenerate unless you find a health pack, which restores it back to full. If your health bar runs out, you will die. You can also die from falling from certain distances and getting slightly nudged by vehicles. Your health and shields will also take damage differently depending on what is specifically doing that damage, which I will go into more detail later. Another feature that Halo has is its motion tracker. It can go by many names, but I prefer to call it the radar. It tracks movement as well as the firing of weapons up to a designated radius. In this game, it's 15 meters. It also differentiates between friendlies and enemies by making them different colors, yellow for friends and red for foes. The only way to avoid appearing on the radar are to stand completely still or by crouching. However, when firing your weapon, you will still appear on the radar whether you're crouched or not. Before I go into any detail on the gameplay or story, I want to quickly mention that for this game's 10th anniversary, a version of the game was released with updated graphics for the campaign. It's the exact same game but with updated visuals. I will go into more detail on this later, but I wanted to mention it beforehand to avoid confusion about the game looking different in certain clips. When it comes to the campaign, I'm going to go through a brief overview for those who haven't played it, then talk about the missions, characters, factions, and overall story. Anything that contains spoilers will either be stated or be listed in the chapters section. So if you've yet to play Halo, here's what you need to know. Humanity is trying to survive attempted genocide by a group of aliens known as the Covenant. The ship you're on is fleeing from an armada. You are forced to crash on a giant ring world known as Halo and spend the game unraveling its secrets while trying to survive. The game has 10 missions for you to play through, each with their own setting. They all stand out from one another and offer unique and interesting ways to play. The campaign can be played alone or with one co-op partner on one of 4 difficulties. Easy is recommended for people unfamiliar to FPS games as a whole. Normal ramps up the difficulty slightly and would most likely be for players who are somewhat familiar with FPSs but don't feel very comfortable in their Halo abilities quite yet. Heroic is the difficulty the game is built around and offers the most fair challenge. It is perfect for seasoned players who like a challenge but don't want to potentially spend hours on a single mission. finally, we have Legendary, the true test of your skill. I would only recommend this after you've beaten the game on Heroic, so you know what you're getting into. The difficulty curve increases with each option, meaning the difference between easy and normal is the smallest, while between Heroic and Legendary is the most. Most of the difficulty comes from the enemies having more health, being more aggressive, more plentiful, and are overall smarter. The only other difference is that weapon and health placements are changed slightly, but they remain mostly the same throughout each difficulty. I'm now going to talk about what I think about the missions from the campaign. I'm not going to break down each one, but instead give my brief thoughts on each. If you would like to avoid spoilers, I recommend stopping at the halfway point in the campaign. I will include a warning before proceeding to the second half. The campaign's first mission is titled Pillar of Autumn, and it's a great opener. It takes place on the human ship of the same name. It contains an in-universe tutorial as well as a few tutorial-like moments if you're playing alone. Thankfully, Pillar of Autumn doesn't throw everything at you at once and gives you a chance to learn the ropes. The next mission is the aptly titled Halo, taking place on the newly discovered Ring World. Its environment is heavily inspired by the Pacific Northwest region of the US. This is a much more open and free level, introducing a new enemy type and vehicle combat. The game even gives you 3 objectives which can be tackled in any order you want. It's my second favorite mission in the game and one that I love to revisit. The third mission is Truth and Reconciliation, which is set in a dry canyon in the beginning and later in a Covenant ship. This is where the game starts to test you rather than teach you. It's one of the harder missions, especially on higher difficulties. Some may even consider it to be the most difficult part of CE. It's not my favorite to revisit due to it feeling a bit drawn out, but overall it's a good mission. Fourth is what most would consider the best mission in CE, and some even the entire series. The Silent Cartographer takes place on and even inside of a circular beach-like island. This is another level that offers lots of freedom as the entire island is open to explore as soon as the mission begins. It contains combat both on foot and in vehicles, and while it doesn't have as much versatility as the mission Halo, the main objective can be approached from a few different ways. This just barely beats out Halo for being my favorite level of the game. I can't really say anything bad about it. It's just a very solid mission. The fifth mission, Assault on the Control Room, takes place in snowy chasms connected by narrow tunnels, bridges, and rooms. This level is overall fun, but can get a little confusing and a bit repetitive due to all the inside areas looking very similar, and sometimes even exactly identical. We've hit the halfway point of the campaign. From here I'm going to talk about the 5 remaining missions and the other topics that contain spoilers. If you want to jump to the next non-spoiler section, you can skip to the time listed on screen or the next chapter listed without a spoiler warning. The 6th mission focuses much more on story than all of the other missions in the game. 343 Guilty Spark introduces the character of the same name, as well as the Flood. I'm not going to go into full detail, but this mission does a fantastic job introducing the Flood. Being set in a dark swamp, it's easily the spookiest mission the game has to offer. Thankfully, replaying this mission doesn't feel like a chore either due to it being relatively short. While it's not the most fun to play in my opinion, its place in CE is absolutely warranted and does its job fantastically. The next mission is somewhat infamous for being repetitive, somewhat confusing, and even boring to some. The library takes place in a multi-story Forerunner facility where you must fight wave after wave of Flood, eventually reaching the top. I really don't think that this mission is hard, but it's absolutely repetitive. I get that it's supposed to have you hone your skills against the Flood, but 4 big floors is a bit much and would have fared much better with either being a shorter mission or having more varied environments. It also suffers from Assault on the Control Room's issue of being confusing due to each room having a similar design. Except I would argue that it's worse here. It's definitely one of CE's weakest missions. The 8th mission is called Two Betrayals, and it's the start of what most consider to be a big weakness of CE. The mission is essentially Assault on the Control Room, but backwards, with the Flood as an added bonus. If you like that mission, then you'll most likely enjoy this one too. For me, it's probably my least favorite of the game. I wasn't huge on the mission it's based on, so this one doesn't feel very fun to me. Unfortunately, it's also similar in length to Control Room, meaning if you just want to get through it, it won't be a short run. It's also what I consider to be the toughest mission in terms of difficulty. I do like how it throws pretty much everything at you. Covenant, Flood, vehicles, and now Sentinels. I like how it's in a way the ultimate test, but I just don't care for the area it takes place in or the fact that it's my second time through. I think this mission would have benefited greatly from non-linearity like Halo or Silent Cartographer. With that mission out of the way, the second to last one is Keys, where it is also unfortunately a retread of our previous mission, Truth and Reconciliation, but I feel this mission is different enough that it doesn't affect the quality. It again takes place both in a dry canyon and the alien ship, but instead of going through it backwards, you visit a different section of the canyon and have to navigate the ship, which is now in disarray and infested with the Flood. You still have most of the old rooms like last time, but its layout is different enough to be interesting. It's not my favorite, but it doesn't overstay its welcome, and in my opinion takes Truth and Reconciliation and makes it better. Finally, we have the Maw, which sees you returning to the now crashed Pillar of Autumn. It, for the third time in a row, is a rehash of a previous mission, although the Maw has the most new to offer. While the two previous retreads mostly only had the Flood to use as an excuse for revisiting the area, this mission is mostly new areas while only visiting a few older places. This mission is probably my third favorite of the game. It's basically split up into two sections. The first being navigating the Pillar of Autumn, ending with a large room where you must destroy 4 objects to trigger the destruction of the entire ship. The latter half is a Time Warthog driving section where you must reach the end of the level before the time runs out. This on paper sounds like a disaster, especially when you take into account how vehicles handle in this game, which I will talk about more later. Somehow this has become one of the most iconic parts of the series. It's a fun, intense rush to the end. The game will give you less time depending on the difficulty you play on, but it's always fair. In my opinion, it's a genius last mission. With the missions themselves out of the way, I wanted to talk about my thoughts on the game's plot. The game begins with the human ship the Pillar of Autumn being pursued and boarded by the Covenant. Captain of the ship, Jacob Keyes, wakes the Master Chief out of cryosleep to entrust him with protecting Cortana, an AI that contains information that in the wrong hands would mean the possible extinction of humanity. Chief takes Cortana and gets off the ship by means of an escape pod and lands on a mysterious ring world known as Halo. The ring's origins and purpose are initially a mystery but very important for later. You soon discover that Captain Keyes is being held hostage by the Covenant on a large ship called the Truth and Reconciliation. Once rescued, he explains to you that the Covenant are interested in Halo because it allegedly holds great power and can be used to control the universe. The next 2 missions are spent finding the Cartographer, which is a map of the entire ring, and going to the control room to learn about and use Halo. Once it's reached, however, Cortana discovers that the Covenant made a huge mistake and has released something which Keyes is unknowingly going to, which Chief must stop him before it's too late. He leaves Cortana behind due to being short on time. Chief arrives at the facility to discover lots of bloodshed, a crazy Marine, and no Keyes in sight. After discovering footage from a Marine's helmet, he's ambushed by the Flood, a parasitic species that feasts on other life and converts it into one of their own. With the captain's whereabouts unknown, he has no choice but to try to escape. Once outside, he is aided by 343 Guilty Spark, a spherical AI that oversees the ring, and a group of Sentinels, robots meant to protect the ring from threats such as the Flood. Spark teleports Chief to the library, where he must retrieve the activation index for Halo, which can apparently eradicate the Flood if activated. It is here where Spark also explains that the ring was built by his creators, the Forerunners, although information about their species at this point is mostly unknown. After retrieving the index and returning to the control room, Chief is set to activate Halo before being stopped by Cortana, who informs him that 343 has been withholding that Halo doesn't kill the Flood, but instead purges the galaxy of any sentient life, thus starving the Flood. Chief sides with Cortana and is then betrayed by 343, who is adamant that the ring must be fired. Chief and Cortana, with the index in hand, hatch the plan to destroy Halo by blowing up the Pillar of Autumn. First, however, they need to locate Captain Keyes, who is the only one with authorization to make the ship self-destruct. They unfortunately arrive too late, as he has already been assimilated into the Flood. Thankfully, however, they retrieve his neural implants, which can be used to blow up the ship. They arrive at the crash site and activate the ship's self-destruct, but are quickly stopped by 343 Guilty Spark. Chief enacts a new plan to blow up the ship's engines and escape before the reactor goes critical. This mostly works, although the pilot who was meant to pick them up was shot down moments before reaching them. Thankfully, Chief and Cortana find a small ship docked and use it to escape just before Halo is destroyed. You also get an extra scene if you're playing on Legendary difficulty. The game then comes to a close with Chief stating that this is only the beginning. In terms of story, I don't really have much to complain about. I think it's expertly crafted and easy to understand. My only potential complaint would be that at the end of Assault on the Control Room, Cortana seems a bit too vague when telling the Chief why he has to rescue Keyes, which makes sense with context in terms of not spoiling the Flood, but comes off as a bit strange, especially on repeat playthroughs. However, it's a small nitpick and doesn't affect my enjoyment of the story whatsoever. The characters are a big part of Halo's charm, and I'm going to explain briefly what I think about each of them. First off, I'm going to talk about Master Chief and Cortana at the same time since they're so intertwined. They're pretty much polar opposites but complement each other extremely well. Chief is generally quiet and to the point while also having a slight sense of humor. In this game, he serves as a vessel for the player to inhabit. Cortana, on the other hand, is snarky, incredibly intelligent, and always has something to say. None of these traits are bad, but just a stark difference from Chief. She comes off as very charming, especially when she gets to play off of other characters. She's the brain to Chief's brawn, though Chief is by no means stupid. The next character I want to talk about is Captain Jacob Keyes. He's a kind-hearted leader who can hold his own in battle. With that said, I can never really invest myself in him. I'm not sure if that's because you don't get too much time with him before his demise or because I played the games out of order. But while I don't care for him and wasn't really that affected by his death, I don't dislike him either. I can't speak for everyone, but he just never really seems to make that much of an impression on you. Next up is Sergeant Johnson, a character who I'm certain wasn't meant to last past CE, but won over the hearts of many Halo fans. He's basically just a named Marine that appears in several missions and isn't important to the plot whatsoever. He could even die in every mission he's in just to appear in the next. He's a loudmouth that has a very colorful way of expressing his distaste for the enemy. His speech at the beginning of the game is a perfect example of who he is and even changes depending on the difficulty. He is also featured in the secret legendary ending cutscene where he hugs it out with an elite before seemingly dying in the ring's explosion, even though he somehow survives. Next up is Echo 419, otherwise known as Foehammer. She's a Pelican pilot that serves to transport the Chief between missions and occasionally drops off vehicles to aid you during missions. I can't really describe her much besides that she's also got a sense of humor while still being helpful. You never see her, and overall I don't feel like there's enough to get invested in her character. So you could probably guess that her death also didn't affect me much at all. Finally, we have 343 Guilty Spark, a character that exudes personality just by talking. His unique voice along with his analytical and arguably cold approach can be quite entertaining, especially when he's humming various songs to himself while you're fighting for your life. He works super well as a villain, and his motivations, while flawed, are understandable to an extent. Out of CE's 6 notable characters, 4 are hits and 2 are slight misses. I can't really discredit the game much for its 2 misfires due to having to introduce a new universe, species, and other characters all in 10 missions. When it comes to the factions in Combat Evolved, they're surprisingly diverse and interesting. First off are the humans, of which the ones that fight are known as the UNSC. They are arguably the least interesting when compared to the other 3 groups, but it's easy to see why. They're mostly made up of Marines, with the only exception being Keyes, Cortana, and Master Chief. They're pretty much as you would expect humans to be. Their armor, weaponry, and style is somewhat similar to what we see in the real-life military, but with a slight futuristic twist. In terms of gameplay, Marines don't have energy shields like Chief, so they're very fragile. They do, however, provide colorful commentary on the battlefield and can be useful when backed up by them in a fight. Next is the Covenant, a religious cult which is made up of 4 species of enemies in this game. Their design is very purple and blue, which contrasts nicely with the UNSC's green. They also use weapons that don't fire conventional bullets, but instead mostly plasma. They're mostly one-dimensional in Combat Evolved in terms of motivation and really just serve to be heartless enemies. For the first game in the series, they don't really need to be much more than that. When it comes to fighting them, the different species use different tactics, but overall fight smarter than you'd expect. They're also given different colored armor to denote their rank. The higher the rank, the tougher they are. Grunts are the first species and serve as mostly cannon fodder as they are very weak and cowardly. Their one saving grace is that they're the most abundant species out of the 4. They can also operate shade turrets but not vehicles. They're the only species of the 4 in CE to speak English. Next up are the Jackals. While they're also not very strong, they make up for it by wielding circular energy shields that cover most of their body. They're seen less than grunts, but more than anything else. The third species is Hunters. They're large and always come in pairs of 2. They're not very fast, but make up for it with their heavy armor, arm shield, and fuel rod arm cannon. Their weakness lies in the gaps in their armor, specifically on their back. Last but certainly not least are Elites. They're probably the most interesting out of the 4 species. They're the smartest and are always commanding the lesser species. Much like Master Chief, they have energy shields and health, and they can operate any vehicle as well as use most of the Covenant's weaponry. They even take cover when their shields fall or when they're out of shooting range, and rush the Chief when he takes enough damage. The next faction is the Forerunners. The only representation they have in CE is 343 Guilty Spark and the Sentinels. While they as a species have a lot of significance in the story, they're mostly a mystery for now. I've already talked about Guilty Spark at length, and he doesn't even do anything in terms of gameplay, but his Sentinels are a different case. They're flying robots that protect the ring no matter who is trying to meddle with it. As allies, they are somewhat useful at distracting and taking down the Flood. As foes, they act similarly, the only difference being their target. They have energy shields around them and are very susceptible to plasma damage. They usually come in groups of 4. Lastly is the Flood. While not depicted in-game, they take over other species to use as hosts. Their style of combat is much different from any of the other factions. Instead of using tactics, they will rush their adversaries until one side is lost. They come in 3 forms. Infection, which is the small but numerous popcorn-like form. Their only goal is to dogpile you until you die. Then there's combat forms, which is what happens when an infection form takes over a host. In CE, they come in 2 subforms, Elite and Marine. You could kinda guess which each means and don't offer much of a difference in gameplay besides a slight size difference. They can wield any of the game's normal weapons besides sniper rifles or even nothing at all. Thankfully, their arms can be shot off to make them easier to handle. They also have a chance of reanimating after being quote-unquote killed. The reason for their not being Grunt, Jackal, or Hunter Flood forms is only for gameplay reasons. I kinda wish we could see what they'd look like in-game, but to this day we still haven't gotten the opportunity. The third and final form is the Carrier form. They're fairly slow and will explode when they take enough damage, are blown up, or get close enough to the player. Once they explode, they'll release a handful of infection forms to take their place. This game is so diverse in terms of enemy variety, and I love it. The last important aspect of the campaign is the way you choose to play it. The Anniversary version is essentially a new set of graphics, music, sound, and UI overlaid over the original game. Thankfully, in any version of the game where the Anniversary graphics are present, there is a toggle to switch between the 2 seamlessly. This is only for the campaign as the multiplayer was not given the same treatment. The newer graphics are a mix of new and reused assets from Halo Reach, which was released 1 year prior to the Anniversary version. The Anniversary version seeks to reimagine the game with newer technology. The newer graphics do some good and bad at the same time. The biggest plus Anniversary has is its addition of collectible skulls and terminals, features which were borrowed from later games in the series. Skulls are difficulty modifiers that do things such as giving the enemies more health, making the level restart upon death, not being able to pick up Covenant weapons, and much, much more. There is even a technical 5th difficulty option called Lasso, which stands for Legendary All Skulls On. It even got achievements and challenges tied to it in later games. I wouldn't recommend playing Lasso unless you are confident in your abilities in the game and have lots of patience. You will die, and it will suck. Terminals, on the other hand, are short videos that provide extra lore and context to the game they're in. They both can only be collected while viewing the newer graphics. In some missions with repeating areas that look identical or very similar, helpful arrows have been placed to lead you in the right direction. They also fit with the Forerunner aesthetic as well. The game is also overall brighter in most spots, making the flashlight much less useful. You could argue either way as to if this is a good or bad change. Sometimes with the classic graphics, the game can look a bit too dark even with the flashlight, but some say that the newer graphics ruin the atmosphere of the original. Another issue with the newer graphics is that the hitboxes are tied to the original graphics, so sometimes objects in Classic will extend further than seen in Anniversary, which can potentially and somewhat easily lead to accidental suicides. Objects can also be slightly larger than they were in Classic. This causes much less issues, however, due to the only outcome of this being a visual bug. For me personally, I can completely understand people who only like the Classic version, while I could also agree with people that like the newer Anniversary version. It usually comes down to the graphics, and I could go either way. Anniversary is much better to look at, but sometimes causes me issues with hitboxes. I switch a lot, but probably prefer Anniversary just slightly. As for sound, it really depends on what I want to hear at that point. I would never switch solely because I preferred the way something sounded, and I think I prefer Anniversary sounds as well, but both are great. Music is the one aspect where I undoubtedly prefer the original. CE's soundtrack is so fantastic, and I feel as though the Anniversary soundtrack just makes each track sound less exciting, for a lack of a better term. The UI is very similar to the sound for me, in that I don't change graphics just to see one or the other. I also don't really prefer one over the other. There's not much else to say about it besides that the old UI looks old and the newer UI looks newer. With all of the campaign stuff out of the way, I wanted to talk about the game's combat sandbox. What I mean specifically is the weapons, vehicles, and power-ups. First up is the weapons. The game features 8 original usable weapons, with 2 being added to some newer versions for a total of 10. The 2 new weapons are not usable in campaign though. Each weapon has its own unique reticle as well as an optimal range where the reticle will turn red. If a weapon is fired while the reticle is red, you will receive more aim assist and bullet magnetism. Each weapon also has a different melee speed and range. The first weapon I'd like to cover is the assault rifle. It's an automatic rifle that excels at close to mid-range. It strangely acts as more of an SMG than an assault rifle, with a high magazine count, high rate of fire, and short optimal range. It's pretty good at crowd control and against smaller enemies, but not much else. Next is the infamous Magnum. It's technically automatic, but acts more like a semi-auto. Its effective range is the second highest in the game and is incredibly overpowered in multiplayer. It's also one of 3 weapons that can be zoomed in with. It's my second favorite weapon in the game because of its versatility. Next up is the sniper rifle. In typical sniper fashion, it's very powerful and effective at long ranges. It's the only weapon capable of both zooming twice and having a night vision mode. To discourage no-scoping, the reticle will not turn red unless it's zoomed in. The sound it makes when fired in Classic is also a personal favorite of mine. The rocket launcher is next and is another incredibly useful weapon. It does pretty much what you think it would: fire explosive rockets that have a large explosion radius. It's balanced out by its low mag size, low ammo capacity, and slow rate of fire. It's a great vehicle killer as well as a great anything that moves killer. It also happens to be the third and final weapon that is capable of zooming. I also love how the anniversary reload sounds. The last of the human weapons from the original is my personal favorite, the shotgun. What's not to love about it? Great close range damage, fast fire rate, large magazine size. It also looks and sounds incredibly cool both in classic and anniversary. It sucks that this weapon doesn't appear until halfway through the campaign, but with context I understand why. Now for the Covenant weapons. First being the plasma pistol. It functions much differently from its human counterpart. It is one of 2 weapons that fire plasma. Plasma damage absolutely shreds through shields, but aren't as effective as human weapons against non-shielded targets. Plasma weapons are also unique in that instead of having traditional magazines that need to be switched out once empty, they have a battery which ticks down the more it's used. Instead of reloading, the guns will overheat after being fired for an extended period of time and will need to vent to cool down. Funnily enough, that means if a plasma weapon is empty, it's useless, as the only way to receive ammo for that gun is to pick up a new one. Plasma weapon projectiles also tend to travel slower than normal bullets. The plasma pistol has 2 firing modes. The first is just a single shot that can be fired as fast as the trigger can be pulled. The other is an overcharged shot that can be achieved by holding down the trigger for a second or so. This will instantly bring any shield it hits to 0. It will also automatically overheat the weapon once fired. The overcharged shot also slightly tracks to its target if it's in its optimal range. The other plasma weapon is the plasma rifle, which is essentially a counterpart to the assault rifle. It's an automatic weapon with a somewhat slow rate of fire. It has surprisingly good red reticle range and has a unique trait that makes it stun the target when they're shot, making it more difficult for them to turn. It's my 3rd favorite weapon in the game, which hasn't always been the case. Once I found out how fun and useful it is to use, it became a favorite of mine pretty quickly. The final original weapon is the very alien Needler. It also functions like the assault rifle, being automatic and even having a more traditional magazine. This weapon starts to stand out once you learn that it fires heat-seeking needles that embed themselves into their target. Once embedded, they will explode, causing a small amount of extra damage. If the target is filled with enough needles, they'll create a much larger combined explosion that almost always results in a kill. This is known as a super combine. While this weapon is super cool from both a visual and functional standpoint, it falls just a little flat in execution. The weapon is much less useful on higher difficulties in campaign due to how slow the needles travel. It fills a role similar to an SMG rather than an assault rifle, despite its fairly high red reticle range. After its initial release on Xbox, Halo CE was ported over to PC a few years later, with new additions which include 2 new weapons. These were only made usable in multiplayer, however, which is odd for a reason I'll get into in a moment. The first weapon is the flamethrower. The target will stay on fire and take chip damage for a few seconds after the shooting is stopped. It has a cool design and would have been cool to see in the campaign. The other weapon is the fuel rod gun. You might remember this from the campaign, only being wielded by Spec Ops grunts. However, the weapon isn't usable in campaign, even in later versions despite being in multiplayer. Instead, the gun explodes when the grunt is killed. It acts as a Covenant rocket launcher with a few quirks of its own. The weapon is battery operated instead of using a magazine. This means that it overheats like the other 2 plasma weapons mentioned previously. The weapon also fires in an arc rather than straight on. Before I move on to vehicles, I want to briefly mention the game's 2 completely unusable weapons that are only seen in the campaign. First is the Sentinel Beam, which is used by Sentinels and fires a constant beam. Not much else to say about it really. The other weapon is the iconic Energy Sword, which can be seen wielded by both Spec Ops and Zealot elites. It's a melee weapon that kills the player in 1 to 2 hits depending on the difficulty. A subset of weapons is the game's grenades. There are 2 types, and up to 4 of each can be carried at any given time. First are the UNSC frag grenades, which are somewhat like standard grenades. Once thrown, they will bounce off of any surface with their momentum and eventually come to rest. Once at rest, they will explode. Pretty simple. The other type is the Covenant plasma grenades. Unlike frags, they don't bounce much, but stick to their target instead. After a few seconds after sticking to their target, they will explode. They can only stick to players, allies, enemies, and vehicles. Anything else they're thrown out will result in them bouncing off and landing on the ground. In campaign, they are sometimes dropped by enemies when they're killed. Explosions of any kind could also set off grenades that are sitting in their radius, resulting in a chain reaction of explosions. This can feel a bit random at times and result in what can feel like a cheap death. Especially when in co-op, an explosion that kills your partner can also set off their drop grenades in the same explosion, resulting in a potential 8 grenade chain reaction, which will likely catch you in the crossfire. Oddly enough, this quirk is absent for multiplayer. With the biggest part of the sandbox out of the way, let's dive into the game's vehicles. There's a total of 7, one of which can only be accessed by the Covenant. Any vehicle that is driven will automatically switch the player to a third-person perspective unless they're in a seat that allows them to fire their normal weapons. Something I must say before continuing is that the way vehicles in CE handles feels very slippery and floaty. If you played any other game in the series, you'll know that the difference is incredibly noticeable. While I would overall say it's a negative, the controls aren't bad, just that they take some getting used to. Thankfully, if any vehicle is flipped over or on its side, which with the physics tend to happen often, it can be flipped back over by any player by simply pressing a button, but not before ejecting any player that was in the vehicle when the accident occurred. The first vehicle I want to talk about is my personal favorite, not only in this game, but the entire series as a whole, the UNSC Warthog. It functions as both a transport and attack vehicle. It can seat a driver, a passenger in the passenger seat, and a passenger to man the mounted machine gun turret. The driver is able to see the passenger's health bars at all times. The mounted turret is automatic and can be fired indefinitely. The passenger stays in first person and has a slightly more limited moveset compared to what they have on foot. The only differences being that you can't reload unless your weapon is empty and you are unable to melee. Funnily enough, you can throw grenades despite there not being a proper animation for it, so instead you'll stand up in the passenger seat to throw it before sitting back down. The Warthog even got a second variant in later releases, which is the Rocket Hog. It's identical to the normal Warthog, but the machine gun turret is replaced with a slow-firing rocket launcher turret. Next up is the Scorpion tank. This is much more of a solo vehicle as the driver mans both the machine gun turret and explosive cannon. Passengers can ride on the treads, however, and have the same traits as a passenger of a Warthog does. Weirdly enough, though, the driver cannot see their teammates' health. Moving on to the Covenant side of things, we have the very underwhelming Shade Turret. This is CE's only stationary vehicle that fires what seems to be the same kind of plasma that the Spirit's turrets fire at you. It has extremely slow projectiles and has no redeeming qualities. If this is your favorite vehicle, then please find a new favorite because you clearly have no taste. Next is the Ghost. This is another one-person vehicle, but this one acts more as an alien motorcycle. It also has 2 plasma guns on the front that alternate firing to make it shoot as fast as possible. Its range isn't great, however, so it's great for guerrilla tactics. The last of the accessible vehicles is the Banshee. It's the game's only air vehicle and has lots of versatility. While it can only hold one pilot, said pilot has access to both a plasma turret much like the Ghost, and also a fuel rod projectile which is known by most as the Banshee Bomb. Then we have the Wraith, a Covenant tank that can only be driven by elites. It fires mortars that arc through the air before landing and exploding. There's not much else to say about them besides that it's really strange that they can't be used by players and was never added to later versions despite all of the new content that would be added instead. Covenant vehicles specifically act different in campaign than they do in multiplayer. What I mean by this is in campaign, if a Covenant vehicle is being used, then it has its own health bar. Once the vehicle is damaged enough, the vehicle will explode and become inaccessible. In multiplayer, every vehicle is invulnerable, but UNSC vehicles and the Shade Turret are indestructible across the entire game. Something I do like is the naming conventions between both factions for their vehicles. If you haven't noticed yet, the UNSC named their vehicles after animals, while the Covenant named theirs after supernatural beings. Except for the Shade Turret, because no one cares about it. The last and arguably least interesting part of the sandbox are the power-ups. Halo CE has 2, which are present in both campaign and multiplayer. First up is the Overshield, which is portrayed as a red ball in a clear cube. When you walk over it, your shields will overcharge with 2 extra shields. 1 red, and 1 green. Once depleted, they do not regenerate. You also have a second or two of invincibility while it's being applied. In multiplayer, they will decay over time, eventually running out, but in campaign, they are only depleted by damage. I'm assuming this is to encourage you to use the power-up proactively. The other power-up is Active Camo. It is represented by a blue ball inside of a bluish pyramid. This will turn you almost completely invisible. The only hint of your Spartan is a warped effect around where you're moving. This wears off after about 45 seconds. The camo effect will be less effective when moving fast, jumping, and shooting, with each action making you more visible. Both power-ups can be used at the same time and don't interfere with one another. Even though campaign is typically regarded as CE's main attraction, it still has an engaging and fun multiplayer mode. Multiplayer has several game types and maps that makes it incredibly replayable. However, the basics are usually the same. As most game types are team-based, you usually spawn on a team with other players and fight against the enemy team. However, there is also a free-for-all game type where it's every Spartan for themselves. Each map has weapons, grenades, and power-ups placed in set locations which can be picked up by any player. Every player starts with the same loadout, which is usually an assault rifle, magnum, and 2 frag grenades. The maps usually have power positions that house power weapons such as a rocket launcher, sniper rifle, and even power-ups. The abundance of game types also help keep things varied and interesting. There's Slayer, which is your basic deathmatch game mode, where the team or player with the most kills wins. Capture the Flag, which sees 2 teams vying over each other's flag while trying to protect their own. If you're carrying the flag, you will be unable to use any weapons, but the flag can be used as a melee weapon, and you could enter any vehicle while carrying it. The flag will be visible when you're in a passenger seat, but will disappear if you're driving. King of the Hill is a small area of the map that, when entered, earns you points. The hill will move after a set amount of time has passed. The first person or team to score enough points wins. Oddball is somewhat of a mix between CTF and King of the Hill. A skull will spawn on the map, and when it's picked up, you will have similar properties to when you're carrying the flag, but instead of taking it back to a base, you score points for every second you're holding the skull. The first team or person to get a set score will win. The final of the main game types is Race. This is a little different than it may seem at first though. Your goal is to walk or drive to set marks on the map. The first person to complete a certain number of laps wins. I expected this game type to just spawn everyone in vehicles and have the game type revolve only around driving. I've never played this in matchmaking or anything, but it seems like it could be chaotic fun. Those 5 game types are just scratching the surface. The game allows you to customize some of its game type settings, which open up the floodgates for possibilities. Want to play Slayer but everyone's invisible? How about CTF where the only weapons are rocket launchers? These are just basic things I thought of off the top of my head, but there's so much more you can do with these options. The game can support a total of 16 players with up to 4 locally via split screen. In terms of maps, the original game launched with a whopping 13, with 6 more being added with the release of the PC version. Maps are typically split into Arena, which is 4v4, or Big Team Battle, which is 8v8 with vehicles. There are 9 maps that are undoubtedly made for Arena, while 8 maps, including the 6 that were added later on, are for BTB. 2 of the maps are ambiguous, so I will cover them in between the 2. Admittedly, my first exposure to this game's multiplayer didn't come until the release of the Master Chief Collection, so I don't have much knowledge about these maps as others who have played longer may have. Since there are a lot of maps, I'm going to go through them quickly and give my opinion on them, but there may be a few exceptions. I'll start with the Arena maps. Battle Creek. Pretty standard red versus blue, but in a good way. Not much more to say about it. Chill Out. Middle of the road, not my favorite, but not bad. Chiron TL34. Nothing but teleporters. Craziest map Halo's ever had. I could go either way in terms of liking it. Damnation. My personal favorite Arena map in CE. I love the setting and it's fun to play on. Derelict. Worst version of Wizard, which isn't even good itself. Would have been better if it was 4-way symmetrical. Longest. Just a long dark hallway. I've thankfully never played on it before. Prisoner. 4 floors of madness. Whoever has the high ground is usually winning. I don't think I've ever enjoyed playing on it. Rat Race. Fun map with lots of different paths to take. It really lives up to its name. Wizard. Far away symmetrical but feels way too small. Now for the two ambiguous maps. Hang 'em High. Feels more like an arena map to me. It's pretty iconic, but I'm not a huge fan of playing on it. If you want to know why the Magnum is regarded as overpowered, then play on this map. Boarding action. Better suits 8v8 due to its size. I love the ship-to-ship idea. I wouldn't mind seeing it return some way, someday in a future game. Lastly, we have the big team battle maps. I'll start with the 2 original, then move on to the 6 added post-launch. Blood Gulch. A large canyon with 2 opposing bases at either side. One of, if not the most iconic Halo map. It was the setting/birthplace of the popular web series Red vs. Blue. Pretty fun to play on, but incredibly open. Sidewinder. U-shaped snowy canyon. Pretty much a worse Blood Gulch in every way. I'm not really a snow map guy. Danger Canyon. One of my favorites from this game, even though I barely played on it. The Pacific Northwest setting is always appreciated. Death Island. Pretty much the Silent Cartographer, but made into a multiplayer map. Genius idea and really fun. Gephyrophobia. Really long, but plays decently well. It's geared a bit too much towards vehicles though. Ice Fields. Big snow canyon with 2 routes to each base. I appreciate the attempt at a better Sidewinder, but it just isn't fun at all for me. Infinity. Shaped like the symbol for infinity and is somehow super fun to play on. Timberlands. Another appreciated and fun to play on Pacific Northwest inspired map, but the terrain is a bit rough for vehicles. The maps in CE are kind of all over the place, but in my opinion work well for the multiplayer gameplay. I don't take a match in CE as seriously as I would in any other game though, due to the chaos and randomness. The final aspect of the game I want to talk about is the customization. Since it was the first installment of the franchise, its options in terms of player expression are very limited. In the original release, your only way of expressing yourself was by picking the color of your Spartan's armor. This would only appear in free-for-all modes, as your Spartan would either be red or blue depending on what team you were on in team-based modes. Thankfully though, the options for armor colors are surprisingly large with a whopping 18 colors. Those of which are red, blue, green, yellow, black, white, pink, purple, cyan, teal, maroon, cobalt, salmon, sage, brown, tan, gray, and the best one, orange. This is a great number to start with. Years later, Halo the Master Chief Collection was released and would eventually see new content released for older titles including CE. MCC is still being updated so the options may increase as time goes on. Weapon and vehicle skins were added along with visor colors for your Spartan. Also, as of writing this video, victory poses are a planned feature. MCC also includes a toggle to disable the newer customization options if you wanted to preserve the old look of the game. I'm not going to list all of the new customization options, but there's quite a bit there to chew on and breathe some new life into this old game. Customization, especially for your Spartan, has been my favorite aspect of Halo since I discovered it, and I'm so glad that they've continued to expand on it with each new title. One last small thing I'd like to mention that I don't think fits anywhere specifically in this video is the ability to lower your weapon. This started out as a bug in CE where if you looked all the way up or down, your character would point their weapon in that direction while looking straight ahead, giving the impression that they weren't in a fight. This has become a great tool for both machinima and screenshot photographers. I'm also very glad that this was made to be a feature in every future game. Throughout the video, I've mentioned different versions of this game several times, which hopefully hasn't been too confusing. I'd like to take the time to explain which versions of the game exist, what they include, and to help figure out which version you'd like the most. First up is the original release on Xbox in 2001. This version lacks any additions made later such as collectibles, updated graphics, new weapons, vehicles, and maps, as well as vehicle and weapon skins and visors. Online multiplayer is only available through LAN, so you can't play with your friends unless they're right next to you. It can also be played on an Xbox 360 with backwards compatibility. A digital version used to exist on the Xbox 360 store, but it no longer appears on the Xbox website, and I don't have any way of checking on the console itself. Thankfully, the disc will work for both the original Xbox and Xbox 360 and only goes for around $10 online, so it's not difficult to get your hands on. The next version with any changes is a PC port made by Gearbox, which released in 2003. This version includes the new weapons, vehicles, and maps, and the ability to play online multiplayer via player-hosted servers. The game also has controller support and staple PC settings such as the ability to change the graphical quality and frame rate. Unfortunately, this port was widely regarded as poor due to the amount of issues present in both campaign and multiplayer. My knowledge on this topic is fairly limited, but some things such as environments and hit detection were broken and lowered the game's overall quality. This version can no longer be purchased directly, but can be downloaded for free online or bought secondhand like any other retro game. A bad outcome of this port was that any future releases of CE were based on this port instead of the original game. When the original turned 10, they released an anniversary version of the game, which I talked about towards the end of my campaign section of the video. This version includes the HD remastered campaign with new collectibles to be found and many miscellaneous features. It also gives you access to select maps from CE remade in Halo Reach's multiplayer. However, the game's original multiplayer is not present. The game also has a remade soundtrack and sound effects. The soundtrack can be switched between Classic and Anniversary in the menus, but the Classic sound effects aren't available. It also added 47 achievements for 1000 gamerscore if you're into that sort of thing. The game has 3D and Kinect support, which I never really used either of, but the Kinect support includes a database which provides extra info on various things in the game, such as weapons, creatures, objects, and more. This version was released on Xbox 360 and can also be played on Xbox Ones and Series X and S via backwards compatibility. This version of the game is not available digitally but can be bought online and from GameStop for around 15 to 20 USD. Finally, we have the version that exists in Halo the Master Chief Collection. This version combines the Anniversary version with the Gearbox port, giving the most complete CE package possible. MCC also comes with every Halo FPS apart from 5 and Infinite. ODST and Reach's campaigns are available but are paid DLC. As of this video's release, MCC is still being updated and new content is being added to every game in the collection. Halo CE has seen a lot of polish and fixes to fix the Gearbox port issues, as well as adding new things like scoring, timing, and new skulls. The game also currently has 700 unlockable achievements for 7,000 gamerscore. They also re-added old things such as the classic HUD from the original Xbox version and classic sound effects. Not to mention all of the new customization options I mentioned before. You could even use those new skins in the campaign. You now also have the ability to change your reticle location, your frame rate can go up to 120, you can change your controller button scheme, and much more. The multiplayer now has matchmaking that is still supported and a custom games browser. It's been updated to support 16:9 and higher resolutions. The only features the MCC version is missing is the Kinect and 3D support. MCC is available on Xbox One with both a One X and Series X and S upgrade available for free. MCC is also available on PC with each game in the collection being available on their own as well as together. MCC is usually 40 USD but very often goes on sale for 20. The game is also on every version of Game Pass. Now that I've talked about the arguably confusing collection of versions this one game has, we have to ask the question, which version is the best to buy? The answer in my opinion is pretty easy. It's MCC. This version is very easy to get your hands on, available on several platforms, and has the most content. However, if you only own an original Xbox or 360, the original or 10th anniversary versions are both great choices. It's kind of refreshing to talk about a game that doesn't have to be emulated or bought with potentially hundreds of dollars. Before I go into my ranking, there's a few things I'd like to say. First is that if you somehow made it this far into the video, I cannot express how much that means to me. I never expected this video to be so long, but I appreciate every view nonetheless. Thank you. Next, since the ranking list is starting to grow, I want to reiterate that I'm not trying to compare every game on this list with one another, and I'm certainly not trying to find out which is objectively the best or most polished or whatever. The list is a fun way of tracking what I would consider to be a list of my favorite games. If a game is above another, it means that I like it more, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a better game. That's not for me to decide. With that, I've thought about this for quite a while, and I have to say that Halo Combat Evolved just inches out Pikmin as being my favorite game I've talked about so far. Personally, I just find myself playing CE much more than the original Pikmin and having much more to do while I do play. Thank you all so much for watching. Please comment. I love to discuss games and would love to hear your opinions. Have you heard of Halo before? If so, what is your opinion on CE? Thanks again, and I hope to see you again soon.